Hey guys, tonight we slip into the chill and flickering shadows of a Viking longhouse. The air is thick with wood smoke, your toes are already half frozen, and the only thing separating you from the cold earth is a layer of straw and an itchy wool tunic that somehow smells like wet dog and despair. You stir under a scratchy blanket of animal skins, blinking at the crooked beams overhead. Outside, a low grey sky presses down on the thatched roof, while wind whispers through the wall slats. And breakfast? Well, it's something. But first, you'll have to get up. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the cold-packed dirt floor of the longhouse, careful not to trip over the blackened dog snoring near the fire pit. It's not so much a kitchen here, as it is a shared breathing space where humans, animals, and food all mingle in a big, smoky group hug. One of the younger thralls has already rekindled the embers, coaxing life into the central hearth, which does a decent job of heating the top half of the room, while your feet remain tragic. Someone shoves a wooden bowl into your hands. It's still warm from the fire and brimming with a kind of porridge. Thick, grey and lumpy, the oat mush jiggles slightly as you carry it back to your straw mat. There's a thin sheen of something oily on top, probably animal fat, or maybe just yesterday's leftover stew trying to be reincarnated. You eat it with a carved horn spoon that smells like old broth and goat. The porridge is bland but filling, and it's probably the highlight of your Tuesday culinary experience. The oats were harvested last fall, threshed by hand, dried over weeks, and stored in sacks that doubled as makeshift pillows. If you're lucky, your porridge is sweetened with a dribble of honey or a spoon of last summer's berry compote. If you're less lucky, someone added bits of dried fish skin for texture. You chew slowly, pretending it's just rustic granola. While you eat, other household members stir. A couple of sheep snort and shuffle in the corner. Yes, they live here too. Outside, someone's shouting about a missing boot and the goat that's probably eaten it. The longhouse breathes into life, full of smoke, steam, and groggy muttering. And all the while, your stomach starts to settle into a soft, heavy calm. Breakfast isn't about indulgence. It's about survival. In the 9th century, Viking food culture was built less around feasting and more around not dying of scurvy. Tuesdays, especially, were not feast days. They were boil something and hope it tastes like food days. Historians still argue whether porridge like yours was made fresh each morning or simply reheated from a communal cauldron that hadn't been emptied in weeks. Based on taste alone, you'd put your silver on the latter. There's some background chatter about the harvest. The barley didn't come in great this year, and the turnips are suspiciously soft. Not ideal, but no one's panicking, yet. Vikings knew famine was always lurking nearby, like an uninvited cousin who shows up whenever the snow melts. They preserved what they could and stretched what they couldn't. Every bowl of porridge had behind it a web of hard labor, tilling, sowing, drying, grinding. And you just had to eat it and keep going. A bowl clinks beside you. Your younger sibling sits down with theirs and starts eating with loud, wet enthusiasm. You love them, but also wish porridge didn't sound quite so squishy. You glance at the fire, where someone is melting a chunk of lard into a small pot, probably prepping for lunch already. Or maybe greasing a boot. Sometimes it's hard to tell. At the back of the longhouse, the old man with no teeth is sipping from a horn cup. It's filled with something warm and milky that smells faintly sour. Goat milk, probably yesterday's. Or the day before's. Viking dairy didn't come from glossy supermarket cartons. It came from the goat tied to your bedpost, who occasionally tried to chew your tunic. It's thick, tangy, and suspiciously warm. Some families used it to soften the morning porridge. Others just drank it and hoped for the best. And that's your Tuesday sunrise meal. A haphazard blend of oats, goat's milk, and resignation. You wipe your spoon clean with a scrap of cloth and tuck it back into the little pouch at your waist. It's rude to let food go to waste, ruder still to show any sign of not liking it. Complaining about porridge is like yelling at the snow, pointless and bad for morale. Some say the Vikings didn't care much for mealtime etiquette, but evidence suggests otherwise. Archaeological digs have turned up personal eating tools, carefully carved spoons, forks, and knives. Each person often had their own set, sometimes even ornately decorated. So, yes, even as you shovel lukewarm slop into your mouth, you do it with a spoon that someone lovingly whittled by hand. You're practically dining in style. As you set your bowl down, your belly comfortably heavy, you lean back against a bale of straw and glance around the dim room. The fire crackles. Someone sneezes. A chicken tries to lay an egg in a boot. And you survived Viking breakfast. Congratulations. You're still rubbing the sleep from your eyes when someone nudges you toward the door. Time to fetch water. The morning wind hits your face like a frozen trout slap, and your feet immediately regret existing. Outside, the ground squelches beneath your worn leather shoes. Mud, always mud. But the frost has only just started to lift. And that's good news, because the bucket you're hauling is less likely to freeze into a solid block before you even reach the stream. When you return to the longhouse with numb fingers and a sloshing pail, the warmth inside is suddenly precious. Breakfast may be over, but that doesn't mean food prep is done for the day. Not even close. You hand over the water to one of the older women, who pours a little into a fresh pot. A scoop of oats follows, then a flick of dried herbs, and soon another batch of that gloriously unglamorous Viking porridge is underway. This one's for the midday crew, field hands, traders, people who actually left the house on purpose, and maybe a goat or two if there's enough left over. You settle into your second bowl, this time enhanced with a splash of goat milk, not as fresh as you'd like. It's clumpy and sour, which somehow makes it more authentic. There's even a thread of greenish cream on top, an accidental cheese-making experiment. You stir it in because waste is worse than taste. Dairy in Viking times wasn't just a food group, it was survival insurance. Cows and goats provided more than just milk. They gave curds, butter, whey, and if things got desperate enough, a source of meat. But on a typical Tuesday, it's mostly about that funky milk. You don't really have refrigeration, unless you count bury it in the snow and hope. So fermentation was your friend. Most milk products started turning within hours. Butter, often salted and buried in crocks. Cheese, made in oddly warm conditions with no clear health inspections. Still, Vikings loved it. Historians still argue whether their cheese was intentionally strong or just tragically neglected. Out in the storage corner, you spot a small clay pot wrapped in linen. It holds skyr, an Icelandic-style cultured dairy somewhere between yogurt and soft cheese. Thick, tart, and possibly older than you. You're allowed one spoonful. You brace yourself, take it, and it hits your tongue like a sour sock soaked in buttermilk. Someone slaps your back approvingly. "It's good, eh?" They grin. You nod, trying not to cry. For all the goat milk and skyr, oats still dominate the Viking day. They're the great equalizer. Cheap, reliable, and flexible. You can mash them, bake them, ferment them, or even dry them into little oat cakes for travel. Today's oats, though, are destined for something more humble: gruel. The second batch being stirred at the hearth isn't breakfast, technically. It's more like a snack you eat because it exists. You watch as someone adds slivers of salted turnip to the pot. That's the luxury version. You eye the hearth carefully. The pot's not quite boiling, and there's a crust forming around the rim. That's where the real flavor hides. The slightly burned, stuck-on bits that someone will eventually scrape off and chew like they've earned a treat. You know this because you will be that someone. It's only a matter of time. There's some discussion nearby about the summer harvest. Someone claims their oat field yielded half what they expected. Someone else blames trolls. There's no real solution, just a lot of shrugging and poking the fire. You grab a stick and join in, helping shift the pot around so it cooks evenly, or at least doesn't scorch too badly. The children nearby are playing with a half-deflated sheep's bladder, kicking it around like a football. One of them falls into the ash pile and emerges covered in soot, cackling. No one stops them. You'd do the same if your lunch was still half-frozen turnips and yesterday's goat milk. Someone passes around hard bread, barley-based and baked days ago. It's more stone than sandwich, and you need to dip it in something to even bite into it. So, you dunk it in your porridge, let it soak like a sponge, then try again. Slightly better. Maybe. The bread, dense and unleavened, was likely baked on a flat stone near a fire or inside a crude oven. No fluffy loaves here, just survival pancakes. Despite everything, goat milk, gruel, scorched bits, you're not hungry anymore. You're content. And in the Viking world, that's an emotional jackpot. Meals didn't have to impress. They just had to fill the hole in your belly and get you through the next 6 hours without collapsing in a muddy field. You think back to last year's summer feast. Someone traded for dried dates. Another brought real nuts. Not just foraged acorns, but actual walnuts. It was glorious. You dream about that sometimes. But today is not a feast day. It's a Tuesday. And Tuesdays are for oats, goat milk, and hard-earned burps. Someone across the fire tells a story about a neighboring village that found a huge cache of buried butter, still edible after 5 years. You ask if that's true. Historians still argue whether Viking butter actually improved with age or just became a weapon, he replies, dead serious. Everyone laughs, sort of. The longhouse grows a bit quieter now. Some people head outside, others lie back to nap or stitch repairs. You stretch, yawn, and feel your stomach protest slightly. Not full, but not empty. You take a sip from a shared wooden cup filled with thin ale. Barely alcoholic, more of a malted tea than anything. It washes away the worst of the goat tang and leaves behind a slight bready aftertaste, refreshing in the most rustic way possible. You lean back against the wall and rest your eyes for a moment. The sounds of chewing, fire crackling, and quiet flatulence become your lullaby. And as the smell of oats, ash, and sour milk drifts up your nose like a sleepy Viking incense, you remember. This is just the start of the day. The sun, such as it is, has climbed a little higher. Not that you can see it through the blanket of low, colorless clouds that hover like a damp cloth over the village. The wind picks up as you step outside to stretch your legs, carrying with it the scent of salt from the nearby fjord and something fishy. Literally. That smell? It's your next meal. By mid-morning, the longhouse's hearth is being cleared of breakfast remnants, and the next food item is already thawing, if you can call it that. It's a length of dried cod, stiff as a plank and curled like a wooden shingle. You recognize it immediately as stockfish. Cod that's been gutted, cleaned, and left to dry in the wind for weeks, sometimes months, until it turns into a kind of edible driftwood. The Vikings adored this stuff. You? You're not so sure. Stockfish is durable, practically eternal, and incredibly difficult to chew. You grab a bit and try to snap it. No luck. It's like gnawing on salted concrete. Traditionally, it gets beaten with a mallet to soften it, then either boiled or soaked in water. Today, it's going into the pot with some leftover stew from, well, a day or 3 ago. You try not to remember which day exactly. You watch as someone drops the brittle cod into a pot, along with a ladle of cold congealed broth, some sprigs of wild onion, and a knuckle bone. The whole thing is heated slowly over the hearth, and you help turn it occasionally with a charred stick. The aroma isn't exactly delicious, it's more like assertive, like the soup is trying to challenge you. This is what passes for lunch prep on a typical Tuesday. The combination of dried fish and whatever's left from previous meals is standard. Nothing goes to waste. Not even the stew that has, at this point, achieved a sort of sentience. There's a yellowish film across the surface that you pretend not to notice. Still, it's hearty. The salty fish adds protein, the broth adds warmth, and the roots soften enough to pretend they're vegetables. There are a few peas in there, miracle peas that somehow survived storage. They're shriveled and slightly mealy, but they make the stew feel more like a real dish and less like a punishment. As you stir the pot, someone tells a story of a man who once tried to eat raw stockfish straight from the drying rack and broke a tooth. He had to gum his food for a month and was mocked soundly for his efforts. Historians still argue whether the Vikings softened stockfish in seawater out of necessity, or just because no one could survive the dental fallout otherwise. You sip from a wooden ladle and wince at the temperature. Lukewarm. Reheating is more of an art than a science here. The hearth isn't precise. It's a series of hot and cold spots that require constant fussing. You try again. Better. The fish flakes slightly now, and the root vegetables are yielding. You tear off a hunk of bread, the same chewy barley flatbread from earlier, and dunk it into the stew, letting it absorb the oily surface. And here's the real trick. You don't taste it so much as you accept it. Like a sleepy hug from a relative who wears too much cologne, you just let the fishy embrace wash over you. It's not bad, exactly, it's just Viking. A cat slinks by your feet, eyeing the stockfish pot with quiet calculation. You toss it a bit of bone, and it bats it away disdainfully, as if to say, even I have standards. You both stare at the stew and reach a silent agreement that you're braver than it is. As you eat, you think about where the fish came from. Most likely the nearby coast, where men spent hours in longboats hauling nets and hooks, praying they'd come home with more than just sea lice. Fish was a dietary staple in Viking culture, especially in coastal settlements. Herring, cod, salmon, they dried it, salted it, even buried it in sand to ferment, not for flavor, for survival. You're starting to understand why they were so good at raiding. If you had to live on this fish every day, you might get in a boat too. There's a fringe theory, you heard it from a traveling merchant once, that some Viking communities flavored their stockfish stew with crushed juniper or wild herbs to cut the smell. You're not sure if it's true, but the idea of a sprig of greenery in this grey sludge sounds almost scandalously decadent. As the stew simmers, your neighbor rummages through a cloth bundle and finds a dried leek. It's brittle, but aromatic, and he breaks it into the pot like he's unveiling a treasure. The smell improves instantly. You glance at him with something bordering on admiration. Not quite friendship, this is the Viking age, but something close. The stew, now thickened and steaming, is ladled into shared bowls. You eat slowly, the salty warmth settling your stomach while your mind begins to float a little. The fish might be dried beyond recognition, but it's doing its job. It fills your belly fogs your head, and even warms your fingers as you clutch the rough wooden bowl. The rest of the longhouse is quieting down. Outside, chores beckon. There's timber to split, nets to mend. But inside, for a brief moment, it feels almost peaceful. People chew in rhythm. Someone burps softly. A child asks if there's more stew. There's not. But someone pretends to check the pot anyway. You set your bowl aside and lick the last traces from your fingers. The smoky air wraps around you like a blanket, and your body begins to settle into that post-lunch haze. Not full, but fed. Not content, but calm. Tuesday's fish stew has done its work. And now, you wonder what bizarre delight they'll scrape together next. Your fingers still smell faintly of fish as you help clean the bowls. Not with soap and warm water. There's no luxury like that. You use a scrap of moss and cold water from the bucket you hauled earlier. The moss is surprisingly absorbent, and everyone swears it's just as good as a cloth, though you suspect they're lying to themselves. You rinse your hands, shake them dry, and move on. By now, the stew pot is scraped clean, and someone has wedged it back into its storage nook, where a crust will form and wait patiently for tomorrow. You take your place near the hearth again, toes tingling back to life. Outside, the wind has picked up, howling through the gaps in the thatch. You smell smoke, damp wool, and something else. Earthy, bitter. Cabbage? You peer around the corner, and sure enough, someone's already begun slicing a withered head of cabbage. The outer leaves are mottled and rubbery, but inside it's still crisp, still edible. You marvel at how this vegetable, of all things, has made it through the winter. You know it was likely stored in a root cellar, cool, dry, and deep enough to discourage rot and rats. Even so, it's no small miracle that this humble cabbage is still alive and kickin'. And what's it going into? A pottage. Not quite a soup, not quite a stew, but the Viking version of clean out the fridge. Except, you know, they didn't have fridges, or much to clean out. The recipe is simple. Dump all the vegetables you have, plus a few handfuls of dried peas or beans, into a pot with water and a prayer. Add salt if there's any left. Maybe even a bone if someone hasn't already boiled it into oblivion. Today's pottage is thickened with barley groats, the leftovers from a recent mash that was supposed to be beer. The beer didn't turn out, which is honestly on brand for Viking Tuesdays. So now, the barley is repurposed into something that, if you squint, looks like risotto. If risotto were made by people who'd never heard of Italy or flavor. Still, it smells warm, filling. Someone stirs the pot with a stick longer than your forearm. The cabbage wilts into soft green ribbons, and the peas begin to swell into mushy orbs of protein-packed goodness. You eye the cooking with the kind of suspicion you usually reserve for mystery stains or unusual barn noises. Vikings didn't shy away from hearty vegetable stews. When meat was scarce, and it often was, plants filled the gap. Turnips, leeks, onions, carrots, though more white than orange, and cabbages were regulars. You rarely see potatoes, not because they were unpopular, but because they hadn't shown up yet. Potatoes wouldn't arrive in Europe for centuries. So, until then, the Vikings made do with the turnip, nature's slightly bitter underground surprise. As the pottage simmers, you gather around with the others, sipping from wooden cups of ale that's so weak it's practically broth. It's not meant to get you drunk. It's safer than water and tastes vaguely of toasted grain. You take a sip, still flat, still warm, still better than pond water. Someone adds a fistful of wild greens to the pot. They're foraged from the slope behind the longhouse, nettles, dandelion leaves, and something you hope isn't poisonous. That one makes your ears tingle, someone says with a grin. You hope it's a joke. Historians still argue whether Vikings knew how to reliably identify safe wild herbs, or just rolled the dice and hoped the gods were feeling generous. A crust of cheese is passed around. It's hard as rock and smells like something that escaped from under the floorboards. Still, it's sliced thinly and added to the stew. Cheese was a treasure, preserved from summer milk and aged in cool cellars. It was a rare flavor boost in a sea of bland. You try a bite of the stew with a cheesy chunk in it, and your eyes water slightly. It's sharp, unexpected, almost exciting. While you eat, you listen to the gossip. Someone's brother traded 2 smoked eels for a sack of onions. Another claims their cousin's cow is giving milk again, which sparks envy. A woman mutters that her last batch of fermented fish sauce went bad, and considering what fermented fish sauce should smell like, you're impressed that anyone could tell. Still, she's planning to make more next moon. You nod solemnly, pretending you'd be excited to taste it. You wouldn't. But this is Viking diplomacy. As the meal winds down, you wipe your bowl with a bit of bread and chew slowly, eyes half-lidded. The pottage was fine, warming in its own grayish way. Not memorable, but it fills the cracks. It's the kind of food that doesn't leave you talking about it. It leaves you able to walk afterward. The fire pops and hisses as someone tosses in a damp stick. You can't feel your toes again, but at least your belly is a little heavier. The bowl is tucked away, and someone begins mashing more groats for tomorrow's gruel. It's a food assembly line that never stops. One pot ends, another begins. You think about the sheer energy required just to exist here. Every meal requires planning, gathering, soaking, fermenting, drying, storing, chopping, stirring, hoping. You think of the root cellar, lined with baskets of knobby roots, jars of dried herbs, clay pots filled with saltfish, pickled ramps, and whatever else someone thought might be edible 3 months later. Nothing is easy, nothing is fast, everything is earned, even the salt. Especially the salt. It's precious. Harvested from seawater or traded at great cost, it's used sparingly and treasured more than some people's shoes. You once saw someone cry over spilled salt. Real tears. Not because they dropped it, because someone else did. You lean back against the wall and listen to your stomach rumble with tired contentment. Outside, a goat bleats. Inside, someone farts. You consider whether that was pottage-related. Probably. The day stretches on, but for now, you've eaten. You're warm, and you're already daydreaming about what might be for dinner, even though you know it'll probably be more of the same. The light outside has begun to dim, even though it's not late. That's the way it works here. 1 minute, the world is washed in watery gray. The next, it's slipping into charcoal shadow. You shuffle to your feet and stretch your back, which cracks in at least 4 new places. That's what you get for sitting on a lumpy wool mat next to a smoky fire in a house where ventilation is more a concept than a feature. Evening's settling in, which means it's time to think about dinner. Again. Yes, you just ate pottage, but in Viking time, meals are more like staggered acts in a long, low-budget play. Dinner is often a second chance. Maybe someone caught a hare or found something wild and weird, like mushrooms. And yes, you know what you're thinking. Mushrooms can be dangerous, but when food is limited, you roll the dice. Someone enters the longhouse carrying a woven basket of small brownish mushrooms. They're dull and shriveled, like something you'd scrape off your shoe. But these little fungi are known, safe-ish, and have been drying above the hearth for days. They're not the kind of mushrooms that send you on a cosmic spirit quest. These are more chewy and earthy, less, I talked to Odin for 3 hours and married a goat. You help sort them, picking out any that seem a little too fuzzy. They go into the pot along with a handful of onion skins and crushed garlic. Garlic that someone managed to trade from a distant trader who probably had no idea it would become one of the highlights of this whole stew. You mash a clove between two flat rocks and toss it in. The scent rises immediately, sharp, savory, undeniably welcome. Now comes the barley again, because of course it does. Barley is the Viking kitchen's version of duct tape. It holds everything together. Whether it's porridge, stew, or just a drink that's gone terribly wrong, barley's probably in there. Historians still argue whether barley was cultivated more for sustenance or for making weak ale. But here and now, you're firmly in the just keep us alive camp. Someone also brings in a slab of smoked meat. Well, meat is generous. It's more sinew than substance, possibly venison, maybe goat. It's been hanging near the rafters since before you arrived. Smoke has turned it a deep reddish brown, and it smells like leather that's been marinated in hope. You slice off a chunk, soak it in warm water, and let it soften beside the mushrooms. While dinner bubbles and simmers, you step outside for a moment into the cold. The air bites your cheeks, but it's refreshing in a brutal sort of way. You catch a glimpse of the fjord, dark and brooding, and the steep slope beyond, dotted with skeletal trees and the occasional shivering sheep. You wonder if any of them taste better than the stew you're about to eat. Back inside, someone ladles the mushroom meat barley stew into bowls. It's dark, murky, and dotted with tiny bubbles of fat that shimmer like oil slicks. You inhale deeply. It actually smells pretty good. The garlic worked. The mushrooms lend an earthy depth, and even the ghost of meat in the broth makes your mouth water slightly. Either it's decent, or you're simply hungry enough to eat your own boots. You spoon the stew slowly. It's hot, salty, and oddly satisfying. The meat is chewy, but at least it's meat. The mushrooms have softened into slippery little ribbons. The barley gives it body. Even better, someone managed to toss in a pinch of wild thyme near the end. It's subtle, but it adds complexity. Like putting on clean socks after 3 days in boots. Not game-changing, but deeply comforting. You mop your bowl with a strip of flatbread, the same old barley flatbread, but toasted a bit this time, so it actually crunches. Small victories. You remember hearing about how some Viking households would grind fish bones into their flour during desperate seasons, just to stretch it. You try not to think too hard about that as you chew. Then someone brings out the real treasure, honey. Just a little, smeared on a chunk of bread and passed around like a sacred relic. Bees were rare and honey rarer. But today, somehow, there's a bit. You get a taste, barely a teaspoon. It's golden, floral, astonishing. It lights up your mouth like a festival bonfire. You close your eyes and try to stretch the flavor across your whole soul. Some say Vikings used honey for more than just flavor, for mead, for medicine, even to preserve fruit in tight clay jars. Others argue it was too rare for anything but ceremonial use. You don't know who's right, but in this moment, you'd sacrifice a toe for another mouthful. As the light fades, people settle around the hearth with bellies warm and limbs heavy. A soft, satisfied silence falls over the longhouse, broken only by the occasional cough, yawn, or squeaky shift of someone adjusting on a wooden bench. You lean your head against a post and let the heat from the fire seep into your scalp. The mushroom stew sits in your stomach like a pleasantly sleepy bear. The conversation, what little there is of it, drifts to food again. It always does. Someone talks about a feast they once attended in a larger village, with actual lamb roasted over an open fire, stuffed with herbs and wrapped in wet moss to trap the steam. Another brags about an uncle who once caught a sturgeon so big they carved bowls from its skull. You're not sure if that's true, but it's impressive either way. And then someone laughs and says, "Remember the year we tried to make seal soup?" Everyone groans. You don't know the story, but the reaction is loud enough to confirm it did not go well. You make a mental note to never, under any circumstances, eat seal. The fire pops again, throwing soft red shadows across the low ceiling. Someone begins sharpening a knife in the corner. Not ominously, just habitually. You begin to drift, full and tired, but still present. Dinner might have started as just another bowl of questionable stew, but tonight's version wasn't half bad. In fact, as you let your eyes droop, you think you might even be looking forward to whatever they scrape together tomorrow. Just maybe not seal. You wake with a start sometime after dinner, not to danger, but to the wet snuffle of a goat sticking its nose through the longhouse door. The animal looks at you as if to ask, "You gonna eat that?" before it's shooed away with a wave and a sleepy groan. It's not the strangest thing to happen during a Viking evening. One time, a chicken walked across someone's chest in the middle of the night and laid an egg. You're still not sure if that was a dream or dinner prep. The fire's low now, coals glowing like lazy red eyes. Someone is adding peat, which smolders more than burns. The result is heat that sticks around and smoke that absolutely does too. You shift your tunic to cover your nose, but it doesn't help much. Viking heating isn't exactly user-friendly. And here begins the nightly ritual, a little more food. It's not always a full meal, more like a snack to stop your stomach from arguing with your dreams. Tonight's night food is a thin gruel, mostly water and barley, with a splash of sour whey stirred in for tang. You slurp it slowly, the wooden spoon rough against your lips. It's not thrilling, but it warms your chest as it goes down. As you eat, you hear someone whispering about tomorrow's hunt. With any luck, they'll catch a rabbit or maybe a couple of birds. That means fresh meat, something beyond salted fish or questionable goat parts. You try not to get your hopes up. Plans like that are about as stable as a cart with one wheel. Vikings weren't always known for their grand feasts. In fact, most days were this, small meals of whatever was on hand. Sure, you've heard stories of lavish spreads with roasted meats, golden mead, and hornfuls of ale. But those were for weddings, funerals, or someone returning from raiding with stolen silver and 3 new scars. Tuesdays? Tuesdays were for gruel and mushroom water. You scratch your leg under the rough wool of your leggings and think about the different types of food preservation this household relies on. It's not just smoking. There's fermenting, pickling, salting, drying, even burying. Yes, some foods are literally shoved underground and left to mellow, like shark meat, which certain northern cousins love. You once tasted it. You also immediately wished you hadn't. Historians still argue whether it was a delicacy or a punishment. Someone's chewing something crunchy. You look over. Dried fish skin. It crackles like seaweed and smells like old socks. They offer you a strip and you politely decline. You've eaten worse, sure, but you'd rather not risk dreaming about fish chasing you down the fjord. Now that dinner has settled and the hearth glows steady, someone reaches for a cloth bundle on a shelf. Inside? Flatbread, again. It's like the household mascot, always around, always reliable, and slightly disappointing. This batch is thinner than usual and baked with a few dried berries pressed into the dough. A touch of sweetness. You take a piece and tear off a corner. It's dry but oddly comforting, like licking crumbs off your shirt after a road trip. And then, without warning, someone gets up and announces they're making skyr. You blink. Skyr. That's rare for a Tuesday. It's a type of cultured dairy, somewhere between yogurt and soft cheese. Thick, tangy, creamy if you're lucky. Usually made from skimmed milk left over after making butter. Then heated gently, inoculated with starter from the last batch, and left to thicken. You don't ask where the starter comes from. You don't want to know. The process begins with a small pot of milk over the fire, stirred constantly to avoid scorching. A pinch of the old skyr goes in. Then a cloth goes over the top, and the pot is moved to the side to do its slow bacterial thing. It won't be ready tonight, but just knowing it's on the way lifts everyone's mood slightly. Dairy is prized here, not just for eating, but for trading and preserving. Skyr can last a surprisingly long time in a cool, dark place. You sip a cup of warm whey while watching the skyr ritual unfold. It's cloudy, tangy, with the faint aftertaste of barn. Not ideal, but far better than the alternative. Nothing. You find yourself thinking about how central dairy is to the Viking diet. Milk, butter, curds, whey, skyr. If it can be milked and won't immediately kick you, it's probably part of the pantry. There's also the very special treat called smør, clarified butter, sometimes stored in barrels and kept for months. It's rich, decadent, and often hidden from children, dogs, and opportunistic neighbors. You once saw someone smear it on bread and almost cry with joy. You stretch your legs toward the fire and feel a pleasant ache, the kind that comes from a day of physical effort, bland meals and slight successes. You haven't been poisoned. You've eaten your fill. The goat is no longer trying to break in. All in all, a good Tuesday. There's one more food item tonight: birch bark tea. Sounds like something a spa would sell for $19.99, but here it's a normal winter drink. Scraped from young trees, boiled until the bitterness calms down, and flavored with, if you're lucky, a dried apple slice or a bit of lichen. You cradle your carved cup and sip. It tastes like the wood smell. Not bad, actually. It reminds you that while Viking cuisine gets a bad rap for being dull or brutish, there's a quiet creativity here. People take what they have: roots, bog, milk, salt, wind, desperation, and turn it into something close to nourishment. They learned the rhythms of the land, knew when to harvest wild thyme before it turned bitter, or when to pull leeks before the frost took their bite. You start to respect that. Sure, no one here's winning a Michelin star, but they're surviving, innovating, and every now and then surprising you with something like berry bread or herbal broth that lingers just a bit longer on the tongue. The last of the food is packed away. Someone snores softly near the back wall. The skyr pot sits quietly by the hearth, slowly thickening into tomorrow's breakfast. You finish your tea and lie back on your mat, your belly just full enough, and your heart warmed by the ordinary magic of mushroom stew and birch bark brew. The fire hisses as someone shifts a damp log closer to the embers. It's still night outside, or possibly very early morning. Hard to tell when the sky hasn't decided what color it wants to be. But inside the longhouse, life is starting to stir. You hear quiet footsteps, a muffled yawn, and the unmistakable creak of a bread paddle being lifted from its hook. That's right. It's baking day. You pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders and watch as the baker, well, the closest thing to one, moves toward the clay oven built into the rear wall. It's a simple structure, roughly dome-shaped, patched with layers of ash, straw, and hardened mud. No temperature gauge, of course, just instinct and the color of the walls. Today, you're lucky enough to witness how bread was made when you didn't have commercial yeast or an instruction manual. It starts with the sourdough starter, which looks and smells vaguely like something you'd scrape out of your fridge's vegetable drawer. But it's alive, bubbling, and crucial. They mix it with ground barley flour, water, and a pinch of salt, just enough to form a thick, sticky dough. The smell hits you as it's stirred. Earthy, tangy, and unmistakably ancient. The baker kneads the dough against a flat stone slab, not with delicate folds, but with confident, rhythmic slaps. The whole process looks more like a workout than a culinary endeavor. And then the dough rests, covered with a bit of old cloth. You're told it will rise slightly. Don't expect clouds of fluffy delight. This is Viking bread, dense and dark as a winter storm. While the dough rests, the oven is prepped. A pile of wood burns inside until the dome glows faintly from within. Once the coals are raked out, the hot chamber is ready. Stones inside stay warm, radiating just enough heat to cook the loaves. The baker doesn't use a thermometer. They toss in a pinch of flour. If it browns too fast, they wait. If it just begins to singe, it's go time. Now comes the shaping. This bread isn't loaf-shaped. It's flat, round, and slightly thicker than a tortilla. Think rustic coaster meets oatcake. Sometimes they press a few seeds or herbs into the top. Today, someone adds caraway. Fancy. Historians still argue whether spices like this were common or rare luxuries. But here, you're just grateful for flavor. The discs are slid into the oven using a long wooden paddle. The smell that begins to fill the longhouse is nothing short of glorious. Nutty, warm, slightly sour. Your stomach rumbles, even though you're not technically hungry. To pass the time, someone grinds more grain using a rotary quern. A large flat stone on the bottom, another round one on top, with a wooden handle jutting from the side. It's painfully slow. Dust flies everywhere. Your arms ache just watching. But eventually, you have more flour. Gritty, coarse, and possibly featuring trace amounts of crushed insect. Extra protein. You're offered a small taste of yesterday's bread. It's tough, chewy, and slightly fermented from sitting near the fire all night, but when spread with a dollop of soft cheese, it's shockingly edible. You chew slowly, savoring each bite like it's the last snack on earth. Then come the bannocks, a kind of quick bread made with whatever's handy. Barley flour, butter, or lard. Sometimes a bit of whey or even ale. Mixed quickly, shaped into thick patties, and slapped directly onto a hot rock. These cook fast and are often eaten hot, with fingers too numb to care about the heat. One of these is handed to you. It burns your fingertips and your soul in the best way. Someone laughs as you juggle your piping hot bannock and says, "Better than seal meat, right?" You nod, mouth full, trying not to cry. This is what joy looks like on a Viking Tuesday. By now, the sourdough discs are ready. Pulled from the oven, they're golden on the outside, dark inside, and smell like hard work and good luck. You're given one with a smear of honey, an outrageous luxury. Your fingers come away sticky, and you don't mind. The bread cracks when you bite it, and you get a hint of smoke, a touch of salt, and that tang from the starter that makes your jaw tingle. It's not light, not soft, but it's real. You think about how different baking was then. No timers, no gluten-free options, no neat dough in a stand mixer fantasies. Just stone, heat, instinct, and patience. And yes, the occasional accidental charcoal hockey puck. Someone across the room is frying something in a shallow iron pan. Cabbage and bits of salted pork, it turns out, with a few slices of dried apple thrown in for sweetness. The smell is sharp and greasy and glorious. You sneak a piece when no one's looking. It's like chewing your way through smoky treasure. They tell you about ash cakes, bread made by burying dough directly in the hot ashes of a fire. The outer layer blackens and is scraped away, leaving a hot, smoky core inside. Practical, if a little risky. You imagine biting into one and accidentally getting a mouthful of charcoal. Still, it's a survival food. Functional and better than air. One of the younger kids pulls out a treat hidden in a woven pouch. Hazelnuts. Probably foraged in autumn and hoarded since. They're roasted, cracked open between two stones, and passed around like golden coins. You manage to grab two before the pouch disappears into someone's sleeve. They're buttery and perfect. As the longhouse fills with the sounds of chewing and low conversation, you feel grounded. Not in the poetic way, literally grounded on packed dirt, with breadcrumbs on your lap and warm smoke curling in your hair. It's humble. It's satisfying. It's exactly enough. You lean back, full but not stuffed, thinking about the baked life of the Viking kitchen. About how every meal depends on someone being willing to knead, stir, stoke, and scrape, often with freezing fingers and no reward but not starving. A breeze slips through the door, and you catch the faintest scent of pine. Outside, the world is still cold and harsh, but in here, in this bread-scented cocoon, things feel manageable. You take another bite of your loaf and decide Tuesday could be worse. You drift somewhere between dreams and the lingering warmth of breakfast bread. Your body curled against the scratchy wool of your blanket when someone casually mentions, "We're low on ale." That's all it takes. Suddenly, you're wide awake, because in this Viking household, low on ale is basically the equivalent of DEFCON 2. The morning light is just now beginning to slip through the cracks in the walls, dusting the room in a watery, indifferent gray. You stretch and listen as the household begins to bustle. Today, the plan is to brew, a slow, fragrant, and slightly magical process involving fire, grain, water, and patience. And it starts, like most things Viking, with a big wooden tub and some cracked barley. The grain's already been soaking since last night, and now it's time to drain and toast it. The maltster, yes, that's someone's entire identity here, spreads the damp grain on a wide metal sheet and places it near the fire. It roasts slowly, giving off a smell like burnt popcorn mixed with wet hay. Honestly, not terrible. Once it reaches the right color, somewhere between sun-touched brown and almost charred, it's cooled and ground, not finely, not perfectly. Chunky malt is just fine. The next step is to mix it with hot water in a wooden vat, the same one that might also double as a laundry tub on Wednesdays. Vikings were practical like that. The warm porridge-like slurry sits quietly as the natural enzymes break down the starches into sugars. Sweet liquid rises, called wort. It looks like weak tea and smells like breakfast cereal left in the rain. Still, this is the base of the ale. Now for the boiling. Into a cauldron it goes, over the hearth fire, and here's where things get weird. Some households add herbs. Bog myrtle, yarrow, even heather flowers. Hops weren't standard yet. In fact, historians still argue whether hops were known in Viking Scandinavia or came later with continental influence. Either way, the brew isn't bitter. It's grassy, herbal, and honestly pretty mellow. You watch as the cauldron hisses and the liquid simmers. A thin foam forms on top, skimmed away with a carved ladle. The steam curls up into your face, hot and earthy. There's something ancient and oddly comforting about the whole process. You half expect a rune-covered sorcerer to appear and bless the ale with a chicken foot. Once it's boiled enough, the wort is strained into barrels, lined with straw or twigs, whatever's available. These are left open to cool. Then yeast is added. Not baker's yeast, but a clumpy starter kept from the last brew. It smells, frankly, like old socks and vinegar. Still, it gets the job done. Within hours, it'll be bubbling like a cauldron in a witch's kitchen. Some Viking households even reused yeast-soaked wooden paddles, handing them down like sacred heirlooms. It's believed the yeasts clinging to the wood helped start the fermentation process. Imagine cherishing a stick covered in beer goo. That's dedication. Now comes the waiting. Fermentation takes a day or two for the mild stuff. Stronger brews take longer. But today, there's enough old ale to tide people over. Someone dips a horn mug into a side cask and hands it to you. It's lukewarm, slightly fizzy, and tastes like wet bread with a hint of sour plum. You don't hate it. Vikings drank ale all the time, not just for fun, but because clean water was suspicious at best. Ale was safer, and weaker batches could be consumed like juice. Children drank it. Grandparents drank it. That one guy who thinks he's descended from Odin definitely drank it. And more than he should have. As you sip, someone starts singing. It's not a loud song, just a soft rhythmic chant that flows along with the bubbling barrels. You don't understand all the words, but you catch the gist. A good brew brings strong warriors, happy meals, and fewer fistfights over dried fish. The ale-making tools are cleaned carefully. Barrels scrubbed with ash and cold water. Ladles rinsed. Everything left out to dry. Cleanliness is important. Not out of germ awareness, but because if mold gets into the brew, it ruins everything. And that's the kind of disaster no Viking wants. You glance toward a set of smaller jugs tucked near the wall. Mead. Made from honey, water, and sometimes berries or herbs. Mead was more expensive to make. Honey wasn't exactly falling from the sky. It was reserved for special events, weddings, ceremonies, or the occasional heroic return from a raid. You've only tasted it once. Sweet, strong, and deceptively smooth, like drinking a very polite thunderstorm. Some say that ale and mead were used to commune with the gods. Others believe they were just the most efficient way to forget how cold it was. You suspect it's both. After a few hornfuls, even goat stew starts to seem poetic. You're handed a second mug. This one's thinner, lighter in color, and has a faint bite, like someone whispered herbs over the barrel. You sip slowly, and for a moment time softens. The flicker of fire, the hum of voices, the dance of steam in the air. It all blends into a strange, soothing lull. You start to notice how important brewing is in the social fabric of this place. The person who brews well is respected. Those who don't? Quietly ignored when drinks are poured. There's no government-issued quality control, just community memory. Don't drink Jarl Einar's batch, unless you want to see tomorrow sideways. One woman laughs as she pours another cup. Last time I had ale this good, I married a fisherman. He left, but the recipe stayed. She winks, and you begin to understand why food and drink here are more than survival. They're stories, passed down through recipes and rituals. You take another sip, the warmth creeping into your bones. Someone claps you on the back and offers you a slice of cheese to go with it. Sharp, crumbly, and perfect with ale. Your eyes start to blur just a bit, not from intoxication, but from the heady comfort of fermentation and flickering firelight. As the barrels rest and the yeast does its invisible magic, you think about how every step of this process, so ancient, so manual, binds this household together. People gather, gossip, laugh, sing. Brewing isn't just making ale, it's making time. You finish your mug and hand it back, licking a drop from your lip. It's not the best thing you've ever tasted. But in this moment, in this house, on this cold Viking Tuesday, it is exactly what it needs to be. Warm, feared, and alive. You blink slowly, eyelids heavy from warmth, barley, and the low drone of contented chatter. Somewhere in the longhouse, someone has fallen asleep with a hand still on their drinking horn. Typical. You give your belly a gentle pat and stretch out your limbs like a very full cat. But just as you begin contemplating a sneaky nap under your blanket, You hear the rattle of antlers and the distinctive creak of leather gear. The hunters are back. The door opens, letting in a chill that nips straight through your socks. In stomp 3 figures, bundled in furs, cheeks red from windburn, and shoulders dusted with snow. They're dragging a sled, more like a wooden tray with rope handles, and on it lie 2 hares, a bundle of feathers that used to be birds, and what might be a fox if you squint and ignore the tail. Nothing massive today. No wild boar or antlered trophies, just small, scrappy creatures. It's the Viking Tuesday version of a grocery store quick run. Got what we could. Their return sparks a quiet flurry of motion. A pair of kids are sent to fetch knives and a basin of snow. Someone else grabs a clay pot of salt and a stack of worn dark cloths. And you? You settle in a bit closer to the edge of the hearth, where you can watch but not get splashed. You've learned your lesson. First up, the hares. One of the hunters, tall, humorless, smells faintly of moss, begins skinning with the speed of someone who's done this 1,000 times. The fur is peeled away like a coat, then hung near the smoke hole to dry. Someone plans to make mittens later. Always mittens. The meat itself is lean, almost too lean. But today they'll stew it with barley, dried onions, and maybe even a splash of ale. It won't taste like much, but it'll be hot, and that's what counts. The birds, wood pigeons you guess, are plucked with quick, brutal efficiency. Feathers fly like sad confetti. They're smaller than you expected, barely 2 mouthfuls apiece, but their meat is dark, rich, and full of flavor. Once gutted and rinsed, they'll be skewered over the fire. You suspect the best parts will go to the elder who lent the hunting bow. Fair is fair. Then comes the fox. A hushed murmur passes through the longhouse, not for food, not this time. The meat isn't preferred unless it's a real emergency. This one's destined for its pelt. Luxurious, soft, and precious. The skin is removed carefully, cleaned, and hung high out of reach of cats, rats, and overly curious toddlers. In a week, it'll be softened with sour milk or maybe even stale urine. You try not to think about that part too hard. As the game is prepped, someone sharpens the iron skewers. Long, simple, and slightly bent from years of use, they're perfect for threading through meat and roasting over open flame. You watch as strips of hair are seasoned with wild herbs, juniper, perhaps, and something peppery from the edge of the garden path. Historians still argue whether Vikings had consistent access to spices or just used what grew nearby. But one thing's for sure, they knew how to make bland taste like bold. You inch closer, just in time to catch the first sizzle of meat meeting hot metal. Fat drips into the fire and crackles with satisfying urgency. The smell is instantly intoxicating, smoky, wild, and tinged with the kind of hunger you didn't know you still had. You feel like a wolf in a fairy tale, practically salivating at the hearth. Next, a pot is hauled onto the stones, and into it goes the chopped up hare meat, a handful of split barley, crumbled dried mushrooms, and a ladle of bone broth left over from yesterday's soup. A couple root vegetables are thrown in, looking like they've just barely survived the winter. It's not pretty, but it's hearty. This will be lunch, or second lunch, if you count your earlier bread binge. While it simmers, you hear stories from the hunters. Nothing dramatic today. One slipped on ice and landed in a patch of thorns. Another spotted a moose, but was too slow with the bow. Next time, he says, though you suspect it's the same thing he says every Tuesday. They talk about deer trails, fox dens, and one very aggressive badger that's become a kind of running joke. Apparently, no one's managed to trap it. The thing has a scar over one eye and limps dramatically, like some small furry warlord. They've named him Snorri. You laugh, and someone tosses you a bit of pigeon meat off the skewer, charred on the edges, pink in the center. It's gamey, chewy, and perfect. A taste of the wild straight off the stick. There's talk of fishing tomorrow. The ice has thinned near the riverbank, and someone's confident they can bring back trout or maybe even a stubborn pike. You nod along, trying to imagine what fresh fish might taste like after so much dried and salted everything. Probably like a miracle. As lunch is served, bowls of hot stew, slices of dark bread, and another round of ale, you think about how deeply tied this community is to its environment. Hunting isn't sport, it's necessity. Every bite is earned, every feather or pelt spoken for before the animal even stops twitching. You remember the saying someone muttered earlier, "Eat what the land gives and thank the cold for sharing." There's poetry in that if you squint. The meat disappears fast. No waste here. Even the bones will be boiled again for stock or carved into tools. A pigeon foot gets tossed to a toddler, who seems unbothered by it and starts chewing happily. You smile, deciding not to question it. A teenage girl scrapes what's left of the stew into a smaller pot. Tomorrow's breakfast, maybe. A second round of cleaning begins, quiet and automatic. Someone sharpens a knife with rhythmic ease, eyes half closed. The house smells like smoke, meat, and pine sap now. Wild and alive. Outside, the wind picks up, whistling softly under the eaves. You wrap your blanket tighter and exhale slowly. You've eaten from the hunt, tasted the forest, and heard tales of angry badgers. All in a day's culinary adventure. On this not-so-boring Viking Tuesday, even lunch feels like a saga. You wipe the last of the stew from your bowl with a hunk of bread that's more crust than anything else, then lean back against the wall with a full belly and the warm flush of afternoon firelight on your face. Around you, the longhouse has settled into a lazy rhythm, half work, half rest. But just as your brain starts pitching the idea of a nap, the air stirs again. From the back of the room comes the unmistakable clatter of ceramic lids, the low grunt of effort, and the sweet, sharp tang of fermentation. Someone's raiding the pickle stash. Preserved foods are the unsung heroes of Viking cuisine. You sit up, curiosity reawakened, as a young man carefully brings forward a wide clay jar sealed with a beeswax-coated cloth. His fingers are stained slightly purple. Berries? And he grins like someone who knows what's inside is going to clear your sinuses and maybe your soul. The jar is opened with reverence. A small puff of vinegary steam escapes, strong enough to make someone cough politely. Inside, sliced root vegetables, turnips, carrots, maybe parsnips, all floating in a brine seasoned with mustard seed, horseradish, and a few unidentified green flecks that might be dill, or might be something someone dared to try once and regretted only briefly. Pickling was the Viking refrigerator before refrigerators were cool. And necessary, especially on Tuesdays like this one, when winter refuses to leave, and the pantry starts to look like a sad museum of dried things. A good pickle adds crunch, tang, and above all, variety. You reach in for a piece, cold and sharp between your fingers. It crunches like breaking ice in your mouth, sour and spicy, with just enough sweetness to keep you guessing. Someone else arrives with a sealed pot of fermented fish. Ah yes, the all-reliable, sour herring. Or perhaps it's trout this time. The smell is memorable. Like the sea forgot to shower for a few weeks and then made itself comfortable in your nose. Not for the faint of heart, or for people with working nostrils, honestly. But here, it's considered a delicacy. A little goes a long way, and they serve it sliced thin, fanned out like it's trying to apologize for its existence. With dark bread, a sliver of aged cheese, and maybe an onion shard, it becomes a surprisingly decent bite, one that'll stay with you for the rest of the day, whether you want it to or not. Historians still argue whether such fermentation methods were everyday staples or reserved for longer-term storage, but there's little doubt they were crucial for survival. You can't hunt every day. You can't bake when you're out of grain. But you can always eat something that's been soaking in brine for 3 months and hope for the best. Next to the fish comes a jar of preserved berries, bilberries, cloudberries, or perhaps lingonberries, small and wrinkled now, but still jewel-bright. Mixed with a little honey and thickened into a paste, they're smeared onto hard bread or eaten by the spoonful when someone's feeling fancy. You try some. It's sweet-tart, earthy, and delicious. Like a jam made by forest gnomes with extremely refined palates. Another popular preservation trick? Smoking. A few strips of smoked lamb hang near the ceiling, blackened and shiny. They're sliced paper-thin and chewed like jerky. Salty, intense, and vaguely reminiscent of fireplace ashes in the best possible way. The process of smoking isn't just about flavor. It keeps flies away, reduces moisture, and gives meat a fighting chance at lasting through the season without becoming a science experiment. As people snack on pickles, smoked meats, and fermented delicacies, the conversations drift into their usual rhythms. Weather complaints, goat gossip, and speculation about whether someone down the road is hoarding honey. You've come to appreciate these ordinary moments where food isn't just sustenance, but something to talk around and joke about. You glance over and notice a small bucket tucked discreetly in a corner, fermenting dairy. Most likely, skyr, a yogurt-like product thick with protein and tang. It's not glamorous. It looks like something scraped off a cave wall. But with a spoonful of honey or a few crushed berries, it's a breakfast champion. You try a taste. Sharp, sour, creamy. It fights back a little, but then again, so do you. And here's a fun little detail. It's said that some Viking households used animal stomachs, especially calves, to help make cheese, using the rennet inside to curdle milk. It sounds unappetizing, and frankly it is, but also kind of genius. The resulting cheeses vary wildly, some soft, others hard, some clearly made in a moment of divine inspiration, others perhaps under the influence of one too many horns of ale. A child offers you a chunk of hard cheese the color of wet sand. It squeaks between your teeth. It's salty, rich, and smells faintly like wet wool, which alarmingly is considered high praise around here. You nod politely and accept a second piece. Someone pulls out a jar of preserved eggs, yes, eggs, boiled, then left to steep in brine and herbs for several weeks. You're told they're an acquired taste. You're also told not to ask too many questions about which herbs or how old the eggs were before they met the brine. You take a tiny bite and discover that acquired might be a euphemism for you'll cry later. The range of preserved foods here is impressive. Not just pickles and fish and cheeses, but also dried herbs bundled and hanging from the rafters, mint, thyme, nettles, crushed and crumbled into soups or teas. There are even preserved meats stuffed into casings and smoked or buried in ash. You suspect that if you asked nicely, someone would dig up a surprise sausage from under the floorboards. This preservation pantry, such as it is the backbone of the Viking diet in harsh seasons. It's the reason nobody starves on an unlucky hunting week. It's the difference between surviving and thriving. You think back to the hares and pigeons from earlier. Fresh food is a blessing. Preserved food is a plan. And here, they've turned the act of planning ahead into a kind of art. Ugly, stinky, sour art, but art nonetheless. As the day stretches toward its quieter half and the preserved goods are packed away again, you sit back, mouth still tingling from vinegar and smoke. You're full in a different way now, less from sheer volume and more from the variety, the layering of flavors and stories in every jar. You close your eyes and lean into the wooden wall. There's a rhythm to this Tuesday, you realize. A pattern that unfolds not in great battles or loud feasts, but in sour turnips and smoked fish, in cheeses that fight back and berries that still hold sunshine. You've tasted the past. And strangely, it's delicious. The smell of smoke lingers on your clothes, even as the hearth crackles softly behind you. Your fingers are still sticky with berry paste, and somewhere between the pickled eggs and the smoked lamb, you've started to feel like maybe your stomach isn't quite sure what century it's in. But no time to worry about that now, because someone's just pulled a round wooden tray from beneath the bench, and on it lies the Viking version of dessert. No, it's not chocolate cake, sorry. And definitely no Viking gelato bar. What you're looking at is simpler, humble, rustic, and definitely a little chewy. A flat, slightly sticky cake made from crushed grains, dried apples, and honey. A sweet ending for a day built entirely around what could be hunted, stored, smoked, or fermented. It's dense, like a granola bar that's been doing squats since spring. You take a bite. It's good, surprisingly good. Nutty from the grain, soft bits of fruit providing bursts of mellow sweetness, and the honey adding just enough golden stickiness to make it feel like something made with care, not just necessity. The texture is a bit like gnawing on an old scroll, but in a comforting way. This is a dessert born from survival, not spectacle. As you chew, the room around you starts to shift again. The day's bustle is slowing. Someone begins to sing a low tune near the fire. One of those songs with only a few notes, repeated like a heartbeat. A lullaby for grown-ups, maybe. You let it wash over you, the rhythm of it syncing with your own tired pulse. Someone pours the last of the mead into a small carved cup. You take a sip. It's not the strong stuff from special occasions. This batch is mild, floral, and a little fizzy, like the ghost of summer in liquid form. Made from fermented honey, water, and a touch of wild yeast, it's less party and more gentle sigh. Just what you need to settle the churning riot in your gut from earlier. This batch was brewed weeks ago, using an old family method that includes singing to the fermenting vessel. Encouragement, the brewer told you, with a wink. Historians still argue whether Vikings really sang to their brews, or if that's just a romantic gloss added centuries later. But frankly, after today, you wouldn't be surprised. Everything here seems just a little bit magic. Another plate is passed around, small misshapen biscuits baked with flour, lard, and sweetened with a touch of berry paste. Not exactly cookies, but close enough to make your sweet tooth perk up. Crunchy at the edges, soft in the center, and dusted with something that might be dried milk or might just be ash from the fire, depending on who you ask. You smile as you nibble on one and think, dessert in Viking times wasn't about indulgence. It was about using what you had. Grains that might go stale, honey that had to be harvested before the bears found it, berries that ripened too fast. It was, in its own quiet way, a little celebration of resourcefulness, of squeezing joy from the cracks of a long, cold season. In the corner, a boy pulls out a carved wooden puzzle. You've seen him fiddling with it before. Some kind of ring and peg challenge that looks deceptively simple, but has kept him quiet for hours at a time. He offers it to you. You accept, try to untangle it for a few minutes, and give up graciously. It's not food, but it's still part of this after-meal moment, a slowing down ritual. Slowing down. You notice now how the longhouse has dimmed. Smoke curls toward the roof hole in lazy spirals. The glow from the hearth casts flickering shadows on the beams above. Everything is golden and low, like the final chapter of a book you didn't expect to enjoy quite this much. One elder begins to grind dried juniper berries and fennel seeds with a heavy stone mortar. Tea, you're told, for digestion and dreams. You're not sure if the dream part is science or superstition, but you're willing to find out. The tea is served warm in small mismatched cups, carved wood, horn, even half a coconut shell. Someone probably picked up on a raid and decided was too good to throw away. The flavor is piney, earthy, and soothing. You sip slowly, the warmth spreading down through your chest like someone laying a wool blanket over your organs. You're full, not uncomfortably, but thoroughly. It's a very specific kind of full, the kind you get not just from food but from time, from participation, from chewing a world slowly and letting its textures linger. Even the animals seem to have noticed that it's wind-down time. The chickens, usually pecking noisily at bits of dropped grain near the hearth, have gone quiet. One of the sheep in the back corner, yes, inside the house, because insulation is teamwork, lets out a sleepy huff and settles in. A cat curls in the crook of someone's arm, already dreaming of fish heads. Someone starts to hum again. A different tune this time, low and slow. Another child's voice joins in, and then another. There's no chorus, no performance, just a communal drifting into sound, like everyone slowly setting their minds to sleep mode. Your blanket is pulled up just a little tighter. Your hands still smell faintly of herbs and smoke. Your tongue is sweet with the aftertaste of honey and juniper. This isn't just dessert, it's closure. The edible punctuation mark at the end of a Viking Tuesday. Outside, the wind sings quietly against the roof, and snowflakes whisper down like secrets from the gods. You close your eyes and imagine each flake carrying a tiny story. A deer that got away, a fish that bit through a net, a jar of pickles opened too soon. All part of the life you've tasted here. Tomorrow, someone will rise early to mash grain for porridge. Someone else will slice leftover hair and fry it with onions. But for now, the fire is low, the bellies are full, and the world is, just for a few more minutes, wonderfully still. You're lying there, cocooned in the quiet lull that follows a full belly and a warm fire, thinking perhaps, just perhaps, you've seen it all now. But a soft rustle behind you says otherwise. Someone's up again, not to tend the fire or chase a goat out from under the bench, but to check the brewing corner. Yes, the brewing corner. Because when you live in a place where water isn't always safe, and mead is practically a love language, brewing isn't just a weekend hobby. It's a lifestyle. The corner in question is lined with earthenware vessels of varying shapes and mysterious odors. You sit up and wander over, drawn by a subtle scent, yeasty, herbal, a little like someone tried to make tea out of bread and secrets. A man is crouched beside a squat jar, checking the bubbling mixture within. He gives it a sniff, then nods with the solemn approval of someone whose nose has been trained by decades of near misses. "Not quite ready," he says, "maybe Thursday." You peek inside and see a cloudy liquid with flecks of herbs drifting lazily on the surface. This batch, he tells you, is for ale, not mead. Made from malted barley, water, and wild yeast captured from the very air. Sometimes flavored with juniper, yarrow, or even bog myrtle. Not hops. Those won't become widespread in beer for another few hundred years. Here, beer is rustic and unpredictable. Some batches are warm and comforting, others are challenging. Historians still argue whether beer was a daily drink or reserved for feasts, especially since brewing requires grain, something not always in generous supply. But the archaeological remains of brewing setups, burnt mash, and even drinking vessels hint that the average Viking likely enjoyed at least small beer. Lower alcohol, more like a fermented barley tea, more often than not. You're offered a sip of an older brew. It's room temperature, flat and slightly sour, but it's also unexpectedly complex, like bread's eccentric cousin. You imagine drinking it with salted fish or onion bread, and it makes a strange kind of sense. It's not about getting drunk, it's about hydration, nutrition, and maybe just a tiny bit of joy. Nearby, a smaller jug is being opened. You recognize the golden liquid before it's even poured. Mead, but this one's infused with something dark and reddish. Rowan berries, someone tells you. A little dangerous if you're not careful, which is not the reassurance you were hoping for. Still, you try it. The taste is tart, bold, and slightly medicinal, but it warms your chest immediately. You imagine Vikings sipping this after battles or storms, raising carved cups in toast to gods or goats, depending on the occasion. Fermented drinks weren't just beverages. They were offerings, currencies, even status symbols. To brew well was to provide for your household in yet another way. And just like with food, everyone had their own recipe, passed down or jealously guarded. Some added birch sap. Others experimented with dried fruits or herbs, thought to have magical properties. You suspect one jug might include crushed mushrooms. You politely decline. A woman explains how they malt barley, soaking it until it sprouts, drying it over fire, and then grinding it into mash. The process is long, requires space, and can go terribly wrong if the temperature shifts or a goat decides to take a nap in the grain. It's part science, part luck, and entirely a communal affair. As she speaks, she hands you a crusty end of beer bread. Yes, bread made with the leftovers from brewing. Waste nothing. The bread is dense, malty, and just a little chewy. It tastes like someone baked a loaf inside a brewery, which, in this case, they sort of did. Not far from the brewing area is a long bench stacked with drinking vessels, horns, cups carved from wood, the occasional bit of pottery. You're shown a horn with ornate metal fittings. It's ceremonial, likely only used for toasts or storytelling nights. The metal gleams even in the low light, catching the fire like it's remembering feasts past. Someone mentions that drinking horns were often passed around at gatherings, not for germ-sharing thrills, but to emphasize trust and unity. You picture it now, a hall full of tired, wind-burned faces lifting the same horn in turn, offering boasts, riddles, or thanks. No personal straws, just a shared bond, spit and all. Later, someone pulls out a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs and flowers. Mugwort, maybe. Meadowsweet. A bit of dried apple peel. These were used to flavor ales and meads before hops took over. You pinch a bit between your fingers and inhale. It smells like a meadow, and an old book had a baby. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. There are rumors, still debated by scholars, that certain Viking brewers added psychoactive herbs to ritual meads. Think vision quests, not happy hour. Was it spiritual, medicinal, an elaborate prank? No one agrees. But the idea that a simple drink could open doors to another world? That much feels oddly believable after a day like this. As the brewing talk drifts into stories of old toasts and misadventures with leaky barrels, you start to see it. This isn't just about drink, it's about mood, connection. Marking time in a world where clocks don't tick and calendars are carved on bones. In this world, a cup of mead is both a welcome and a goodbye. It's what you hand someone after a long journey or just before a long sleep. And as you cradle your own cup now, warmth pooling in your belly, you realize, even if the flavor doesn't always hit right, the comfort does. Someone offers one last taste, a thick, opaque drink with a faint fizz. Kvass, bread beer. Made from stale rye, sometimes with berries, sometimes not. It tastes like a loaf of sourdough, fell into a spring and came out new. You smile. Even the drinks here are resourceful. The fire sputters, the air grows cooler, and the longhouse shifts again. Shoulders hunched into cloaks, cups return to shelves, one final laugh echoing toward the rafters. The brews will keep fermenting overnight. The jars will bubble and gurgle like living things, dreaming their own dreams. And you? You're sleepy now, not from sugar or warmth, but from stories told in sips. Your hands smell like grain. Your breath carries a trace of honey. Your head buzzes, not drunk, just content. You ease back onto your furs, eyes half-lidded. The soft pop of bubbles in a nearby jar, like lullabies for your ears. In a world before clocks, bedtime isn't announced. It's brewed slowly, served warm and shared. The silence deepens as the last of the laughter dissolves into the thatched roof. And you realize something extraordinary. You've spent the entire day eating, sipping, listening, and somehow, still, you're not bored. You thought what Vikings ate would be dry toast material. Instead, it's become a quiet epic. And now, with the fire burning low and only a faint amber glow lighting the longhouse, you begin to notice how food wasn't just sustenance here. It was rhythm, ritual. Even bedtime has its own little snack, has a small movement by the hearth catches your eye. Someone's heating milk, not just any milk, but goat's milk, slowly warmed in a clay pot over coals, thickening slightly from the heat. A pinch of herbs is added, maybe chamomile, maybe wild thyme. You breathe in deeply, and the aroma is like nature's hug. A wooden spoon stirs in a lazy circle, hypnotic. This isn't for everyone, you're told. Just for the young, the elderly, or those who need a gentler path to sleep. You smile. You definitely qualify. A bowl is handed to you, warm to the touch. You sip. It's earthy, creamy, a little nutty. Nothing like modern hot chocolate or herbal tea, but soothing all the same. It tastes like dusk in a bowl. Like bedtime, rewritten by goats and grandmothers. You notice others partaking in their own versions of bedtime bites. One man gnaws on dried fish skin, not for the flavor, which is questionable, but because chewing something tough is said to ease tension. A woman nearby slices a small wrinkled apple in half and eats it slowly, savoring the sweetness locked in from last harvest. Not everything is glamorous, but there's care behind each motion. Even these scraps feel like offerings to rest. Kids are tucked under layered furs, some using stuffed linen sacks as pillows. A baby, swaddled in wool, makes soft squeaking sounds, comforted more by the warmth of bodies around her than any lullaby. And above it all, the occasional creak of the wooden beams, like an old tree sighing in its sleep. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. There's some evidence that Vikings used dream pillows, small cloth bundles stuffed with herbs like lavender, juniper, or crushed mint leaves. You're handed one. You give it a sniff. It smells like a forest having a spa day. Does it actually help you dream of Valhalla or keep trolls away? Historians still argue whether dream pillows were ritual objects, folk remedies, or just proto-air fresheners. But you don't care. You're keeping yours. All around the longhouse, people are sliding into sleep at different paces. Some hum under their breath. Others lie still, with eyes wide open, staring at the dim rafters like they're waiting for a dream to sneak in. One man is softly mumbling a prayer to Thor for good weather tomorrow. Another mutters at a mouse darting past his blanket. Each finds their own way to drift off. As for you, your breath has slowed. Your body, warm from fire, food, and fermented fizz, is finally letting go. You think about everything you've tasted today, every smoky bite, every tangy sip, every strange chew, and realize it was never about the ingredients. It was about timing, about survival, yes, but also about community, about sharing, about slowing down long enough to notice what warmth tastes like. You glance over and see someone gently stroking a carved bone bead hanging near the doorway. It's part of a ritual, they tell you, for sleep protection. Not magic, they say, just habit. But habit, you realize, is a kind of magic. A breadcrumb trail through the dark. And even though it's far from the modern idea of comfort, there's no mattress, no Netflix, no white noise app. You find yourself easing into Viking sleep with something that feels suspiciously like gratitude. Your feet are tucked into fur. Your fingers curl instinctively around that herb-stuffed pillow. Outside, the snow continues to fall, a silent hush blanketing the world. Even the wolves seem to be dreaming. Someone shifts nearby and murmurs something in a language you don't speak, but the tone is unmistakable, gentle, low, and meant to lull. Another bedtime voice, another layer of calm. You're fading now. But before you do, you note one last thing. The longhouse doesn't go completely still. Not yet. There's always someone poking the fire, checking the embers, whispering a tale to a half-asleep child. Sleep comes in waves here, in ripples. Nobody is forced to lie down at the same moment. And yet, like birds on a branch, they all seem to drift together. And when one finally sighs and goes quiet, the rest follow. You let your breath match the fire's rhythm. In, out, crackle, pop. Your muscles loosen. Your mind wanders to those pickled onions, the surprise of juniper in the tea, the wild guess you took on that weird dried fish snack. This wasn't a gourmet experience, not by modern standards. But it was real, honest, ancient, and somehow enough. Tomorrow will come. With more porridge, more salted whatever. Maybe even a stolen orange if someone gets lucky at the market. But for now, the day is over. Food has done its job. Fire has done its part. And the longhouse, creaking like a content old whale, sighs itself into slumber. You too. You wake to the unmistakable sound of chewing. Not birdsong, not roosters, just slow, deliberate chewing. Somewhere nearby, someone's already snuck a piece of dried meat from the communal larder and is quietly working through it like a cow with secrets. You blink your eyes open to the faintest dawn light slipping through the smoke hole in the thatch above. It's morning in the Viking world again, and somehow your stomach's ready for more. People wake up at staggered intervals, rubbing sleep from their eyes and throwing back fur covers with all the energy of wet laundry. There's no sharp alarm, no morning playlist, no motivational quote about crushing your goals. Just the clatter of clay pots and the soft snort of someone still halfway in a dream. The first priority isn't talking or dressing, it's breaking the fast. And in this longhouse, that means porridge, again. You trudge over to the hearth where the same pot from yesterday is being repurposed. Scraped, rinsed, well, sort of, and refilled with yesterday's barley, today's milk, and whatever scraps survived the evening meal. One woman tears bits of sour apple into the pot. Another shakes in dried herbs. There's no set recipe, just instinct and availability. The porridge, you notice, isn't just food, it's a canvas. Each family might tweak theirs differently. Some favor barley, others spelt or rye. One man swears adding dried seaweed is good for your bones. You're not sold. What results is a warm, thick, vaguely grey mass that tastes far better than it looks. It's creamy, a little tangy from the milk, and dotted with chewy barley and the occasional startling crunch of unground grain. It fills you up like a weighted blanket for your stomach. Here's a mainstream fact. The typical Viking breakfast often included gruel or porridge, usually made from grains like barley, rye, or oats. Sometimes it was sweetened with honey or dried fruits, but often it was plain and utilitarian. Fuel more than fun. A soft morning murmur passes through the longhouse. Someone plays a bone flute in the corner, very badly. A child tries to sneak a second helping of porridge. A grandmother swats them with a wooden spoon and then gives them extra anyway. Love, Viking style. You notice a man preparing something slightly more involved. Small cakes made from yesterday's leftover grain mash, flattened into discs, and toasted on a flat rock beside the fire. They're dry, sure, but they smell nutty and comforting. He offers you one, and you bite into it cautiously. It crumbles in your mouth, like oatcake meets river rock. But with a smear of soft goat cheese, it's kind of addictive. Now, here's the quirky bit. While bread was common, especially in larger farms with quern stones to grind flour, some scholars believe Vikings also used pine bark in their bread when grain was scarce. Yes, tree bark. They'd strip the inner layer, dry it, grind it, and mix it in. You're told it tastes a bit like earthy desperation. You're also told you'll be trying some soon. Hooray! The bark bread, when it finally appears, looks innocuous enough. A dark, rough slice with a texture somewhere between cardboard and granola. You bite. It's bitter, gritty, but not unbearable, especially with a dollop of honey. Builds character, the baker tells you. You nod solemnly. Your teeth disagree. Someone's brought out a preserved cheese wrapped in cloth and wax. It's pungent, like feet that have seen battle. But it melts into warm porridge surprisingly well. A good reminder that even the most intimidating foods can have gentle souls. People are more talkative now. Plans for the day are murmured. Tasks are split. A hunting party prepares smoked meat and hard cheese for the road. Others grab handfuls of dried peas and tuck them into leather pouches for a midday stew, wherever that might happen. A small skin of watered-down ale is passed around, just enough to wash down the last of the morning bite. Historians still argue whether every household made its own cheese or traded for it with specialists. The process isn't easy. Milk has to be curdled, drained, pressed, and then aged. It's possible some longhouses only made soft cheeses or curds and traded for harder wheels. What's not debated is that cheese, like everything else here, was practical, portable, and born from the deep need to not waste anything. Even spoiled milk had a second chance. You watch as one woman packs dried turnip slices into a cloth sack. For chewing, she says, as if that explains everything. Another preps a small bit of salted lamb, wrapping it carefully in waxed cloth. This is the good stuff, she warns, as if someone might mug her for it. You suspect they might. The morning meal winds down slowly. There's no rush. No one's grabbing a Viking travel mug and sprinting to a longship. Life moves at the pace of muscle and sun. And once bellies are full, attention turns to readiness. Boots tightened, axes checked, cloaks adjusted. But even that comes second to making sure everyone has something tucked in their belt for later. Food is armor, comfort, and sometimes a low-key flex. And now, brace yourself, you're handed a hunk of something tough and pale, lard, pure animal fat, not to eat on its own, though some do, but to rub on lips, fingertips, and even the inner nose to keep out cold and wind. You try it. It smells faintly smoky, and your lips feel like greased parchment. But hey, it works. You take one last sip of warm milk, the herbs still floating like a lazy leaf, and breathe deep. Breakfast in the Viking world is over. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't plated on artisanal stoneware, but it stuck to your ribs, whispered of long winters, and left you feeling oddly grounded. Outside, the snow has lightened to powder. The longhouse creaks and breathes as people shuffle toward the day. The smell of barley still clings to the air, and your belly, remarkably, is full again. Your modern breakfast might be cereal and coffee. Here, it's bark bread, cheese that fights back, and porridge thick enough to patch a boat. But somehow, you wouldn't trade it. Your boots crunch softly over snow-crusted earth as you step outside the longhouse, the air still wrapped in the cool hush of morning. The scent of smoke and barley lingers on your clothes. Ahead of you, the village begins to stir like a creature stretching its limbs. Small knots of people break off in every direction, some toward the woods, others down narrow paths to the sea, many simply disappearing into huts to work. But your final Viking Tuesday isn't quite over yet. One last meal looms ahead, the evening supper, modest but essential. You won't be here for the next feast, the next salted fish ration, or the ceremonial barley mash reserved for the seasonal blot. This is your last bite, your last dip into the rough, grainy stew of Viking domestic life. But first, there's one errand left to run. You're handed a small woven basket and sent down to the smokehouse. It smells like, well, like every bit of meat that's ever been preserved here since time began. Thick ribbons of salt pork hang from wooden beams. Cured fish dangle like overgrown earrings, and racks of dried reindeer jerky line the far wall. You're instructed to collect a little of this, a little of that. Enough for soup, enough to flavor the thin broth that will welcome the sundown. It's oddly meditative. You touch a fish that feels like wood. You sniff a sausage so old it's probably technically a fossil. But somehow, in this cold, dry air, they're safe to eat. Perfectly edible, if not exactly thrilling. Like eating ancient history, one tough chew at a time. Back in the longhouse, pots are already bubbling again. Not huge cauldrons this time, just modest vessels for a communal stew, a little of everything thrown together with root vegetables. Carrots, turnips, onions, and a few cloves of wild garlic. Someone found a scrap of rabbit, likely leftovers from a hunt, and it's simmering quietly in the back, just enough to flavor the broth. Here's your mainstream fact. Most evening meals for Viking households were stews made from whatever was on hand. Meat scraps, dried peas, root vegetables, and sometimes even bits of grain. It was simple, hearty, and slow-cooked over open fire. Think rustic crockpot dinner with a smoky twist. The stew you're about to eat tonight has no recipe. No one measures. No one checks for salt ratios or optimal searing. It's taste as you go, toss it in, pray to Freya cooking. And somehow, it works. You're given a rough wooden bowl. The stew inside is muddy in color, but rich in smell. Gamey meat, savory roots, and the caramel undertone of onions long since melted down. You dip your spoon and taste. It's hot, filling, and carries that deep, smoky whisper of the smokehouse. One chunk of meat is too salty. Another is oddly sweet. A chewy piece might be tongue or something else, but it all balances. All the fringe tidbit. There are tales of Vikings using beer or whey in stews instead of water when available, to add flavor and nutritional value. You ask if tonight's stew has anything fancy like that. You're told, maybe. Then someone winks. You're now 14% suspicious, 86% hungry. You keep eating. Historians still argue whether the variety in these meals was more about seasonal abundance or strategic rationing. Some believe families stuck to boring stews all winter to save their smoked meats for feasting days. Others say variation came from necessity. Whatever didn't spoil went in. What's clear is that no two stews were ever the same, and yours tonight is one of a kind. As you eat, others join around the fire. It's quieter now, less chatter. People are tired. Today was filled with chopping wood, fixing tools, mending garments, even carving small toys from bone and driftwood. The fire glows steadily, a heartbeat in the center of the room. Someone tosses in a pinch of dried herb, not for flavor, but for smell. A little rosemary maybe juniper. It smells like pine and sun-warmed dirt. It smells like closure. There's a final sip of ale passed around. Not much, just enough to toast the day. A few words are spoken, half ritual, half murmured thanks. Not a prayer exactly, but a recognition. Of full bellies, of safe shelter, of another day survived. And as bowls are set down and blankets unfurled, you realize something strange. You're not ready to leave. This life, so rough and scratched and chewy at the edges, has a rhythm that's sunk under your skin. Food here isn't just something to get through. It's a constant negotiation with nature, a conversation with cold and hunger and time. It's a slow dance with decay. And in that, there's a kind of beauty. You glance around at the faces softening in the firelight. The old man cradling a bowl like it's a story. The child nodding off mid-bite. The woman with soot on her cheek, still stirring, still humming. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And now, the final candles are extinguished. The stew pot is emptied. A carved wooden ladle rests quietly in the ashes. You lie back on your furs one last time, full again, not just in your stomach, but in your sense of time and place. You've eaten like a Viking, not just for a moment, but for an entire day. You've gnawed on bark bread. You've toasted goat cheese. You've sipped wormwood tea, downed dubious lard, and made peace with porridge. And as the smoke curls upward, and the last whisper of fire fades to coal, you let yourself drift toward sleep, carrying the taste of a 1,000-year-old Tuesday on your tongue. The fire is almost out now, just glowing dots beneath the ash. The longhouse is so still, even the wind outside seems to whisper more quietly, brushing against the timber, like it's afraid to wake anyone. You shift gently on your bed of furs, feeling the weight of warmth still tucked around your shoulders. Your stomach is full, your limbs are heavy, and your thoughts begin to stretch out, slower now, softer. You remember the first meal, the cold porridge, the surprise of honey, the tang of pickled roots, the midday stew, the smoky dried fish, that sharp little bite of horseradish. All those strange flavors and familiar hungers, all leading to this quiet end. The voices have faded. Even the baby, somewhere in the dark, has gone still. The longhouse breathes with you. A slow rhythm, like waves against the hull of a ship. Outside, snow settles over rooftops and fences, blanketing the world with hush. You imagine it covering the fields, the firewood stack, the footprints of goats and boots alike. You imagine it softening everything, making the rough edges smooth, the hunger distant. Your hands relax, your breath deepens. You let the weight of the day slip away, each chew, each sip, each crackle of the hearth falling gently behind you. There's nothing left to do now. No more dishes, no more firewood, no more salted fish to untangle. Just quiet, just the long, slow drift towards sleep. And as your eyes finally close, you carry with you something simple, something ancient. The quiet truth that even 1,000 years ago, someone sat by firelight, full and tired, just like you, and let the dark come in gently. Sleep now.